It was supposed to be the perfect escape. Just three friends, a cozy cabin, and a weekend away from the chaos of city life. Sarah, Mike, and Emily had planned this trip for months. The cabin, nestled deep in the woods, seemed like the ideal spot for a peaceful retreat. As they drove through the dense forest, the sunlight barely piercing through the thick canopy of trees, they joked about urban legends and ghost stories, completely unaware of the terror that awaited them. The cabin appeared just as they had imagined, quaint, rustic, and isolated. It was the perfect place to unwind. After unloading their bags, the friends settled in for the evening. They built a fire in the old stone fireplace, its crackling flames casting flickering shadows across the room. The atmosphere was cozy, and soon the laughter and conversation flowed freely. But as the night deepened, a sense of unease began to creep into the cabin. Sarah noticed it first. A strange, almost imperceptible feeling that something was off. She dismissed it as her imagination playing tricks on her in the unfamiliar surroundings. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. The first strange occurrence happened around midnight. They were playing cards when Emily suddenly stopped and tilted her head. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The other two listened closely, but all they could hear was the wind rustling through the trees outside. They shrugged it off, attributing it to the natural sounds of the forest. But then, it happened again. This time, they all heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound like someone knocking on wood. The sound seemed to come from all around them, echoing through the cabin. Mike, always the skeptic, stood up to investigate. He walked around the cabin, checking the windows and doors, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The sound had stopped as abruptly as it had started. They tried to return to their game, but the atmosphere had changed. The light-hearted banter was replaced by nervous glances and forced smiles. The tapping sound returned, louder this time, accompanied by a low, almost inaudible whispering. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking to them. The next morning, the friends awoke to a disturbing sight. Scrawled on the walls in what appeared to be red paint were strange symbols, twisted, incomprehensible markings that none of them recognized. They were not there the night before. Panic set in as they realized that something, or someone, had been in the cabin while they slept. Determined to leave, they packed their bags quickly and headed for the door. But as they stepped outside, they were met with an even more horrifying discovery. Surrounding the cabin, in a perfect circle, were dozens of small, hand-carved wooden figures. Each figure was a crude representation of a person, their faces contorted in expressions of fear and agony. The figures were eerily lifelike, and as they examined them closer, Sarah gasped. One of the figures was wearing a tiny replica of the necklace she was wearing, a necklace she had bought just before the trip. Another figure was holding a small camera, just like Mike's. The realization hit them all at once. These figures were meant to represent them. Fear gripped them as they hurried back inside, locking the door behind them. They huddled together, trying to come up with a plan. But as night fell, their situation grew increasingly desperate. The sounds outside grew louder, footsteps crunching on leaves, the creaking of branches, and that incessant tapping. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. The only light came from the dying embers in the fireplace. Emily screamed as she felt something brush against her leg, a cold, clammy hand. Mike lit a match, and in the brief flare of light they saw them, shadowy figures moving around the room, their faces obscured by darkness. The match burned out, leaving them in darkness once again. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as the figures closed in. Desperate, they fumbled for the door, but it wouldn't budge. They were trapped. In a moment of sheer terror, Mike found an old lantern and managed to light it. The dim light cast long shadows across the room, revealing the figures in full. They were not human. Twisted, nightmarish creatures with hollow eyes and mouths that gaped in silent screams. They moved closer, surrounding the three friends. With no other option, Sarah grabbed a piece of burning wood from the fireplace and swung it at the nearest figure. To her shock, the figure disintegrated into a cloud of dust. Realizing that light was their only weapon, they held the lantern and burning wood high, pushing the creatures back. Inch by inch, they made their way to the door. Finally, with one last effort, they burst through the door and ran into the woods. They didn't stop until they reached their car, hearts pounding in their chests. They sped away, never looking back, the horrors of the night etched into their minds forever. To this day, none of them speak of what happened in that cabin, but they all know one thing: something evil lurks in those woods, waiting for its next victims. Karen had always been a night owl, which made her perfect for the late-night shifts at the small 24-hour convenience store where she worked. The store was located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods and far from any other buildings. It was usually quiet at night, with only the occasional trucker or traveler stopping by for gas or a quick snack. Karen enjoyed the solitude, using the time to catch up on reading or listen to her favorite podcasts. One particular night, everything felt different. From the moment she clocked in, she had an uneasy feeling she couldn't shake. The store felt colder than usual, and the fluorescent lights flickered intermittently. Dismissing it as just another power issue, she settled behind the counter, trying to focus on her book, but the nagging feeling that something was wrong wouldn't go away. Around midnight, the store was completely empty. Karen was about to step outside for a breath of fresh air when she noticed something strange. Through the large glass windows, she saw a figure standing just at the edge of the parking lot, barely visible in the dim light. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. Karen felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't make out any details of the person. It was as if they were cloaked in shadow. She waited for a few minutes, hoping they would leave, but the figure remained motionless. Growing more uneasy by the second, she locked the door, a small comfort against the unknown presence outside. The hours dragged on and the figure outside didn't move an inch. Karen kept glancing at the windows, her anxiety growing. Every so often, she thought she saw the figure shift slightly, but it was so subtle she couldn't be sure if it was real or just her imagination. The store was eerily quiet, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator units and the occasional creak of the buildings settling. As the clock ticked closer to 2 a.m., Karen decided to call her manager, Mr. Stevens. She dialed his number, but all she got was his voicemail. She left a message, trying to keep her voice steady, though she could hear the tremor in her own words. "Hi, Mr. Stevens, it's Karen. There's someone outside the store just standing there. I'm not sure what to do. Could you give me a call back when you get this?" She hung up and tried to distract herself by organizing the shelves, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the figure outside. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the store into darkness. Karen's heart raced as she fumbled for her flashlight. Her hands shaking, she shone the beam toward the windows, but the figure was gone. Relief washed over her. Maybe they had finally left. But just as quickly, her relief turned to terror when she heard a faint scratching sound coming from the back of the store. The sound was low, methodical, as if something, or someone, was trying to get in. Karen's breath caught in her throat as she moved toward the back of the store, the flashlight beam trembling in her unsteady hand. The scratching sound continued, growing louder the closer she got. It seemed to be coming from the storage room. She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to turn back, but she needed to know what was making that noise. Slowly, she reached for the door handle and twisted it open. The storage room was pitch black, the smell of stale air hitting her as she entered. She swept the flashlight around the room, searching for the source of the sound, but there was nothing. Just the usual boxes of supplies and shelves filled with stock. Then she noticed it, a small narrow window high up on the back wall. The window was open, the cold night air seeping in. Her mind raced as she pieced it together. Someone had been trying to break in. She quickly shut the window and locked it, backing away as her fear turned to full-blown panic. Just as she was about to leave the storage room, the door slammed shut behind her. She spun around, shining the flashlight toward the door, but it was empty. The scratching sound returned, now coming from inside the room. It was louder, more frantic, as if whatever was making it was right there with her. Karen backed into a corner, her eyes darting around the room, trying to find the source. Suddenly, the scratching stopped and the room fell into an oppressive silence. She held her breath, straining to hear anything, when she felt something brush against her leg. She looked down, and in the dim light she saw it, a hand, pale and skeletal, reaching out from under a stack of boxes. Karen screamed and bolted out of the storage room, slamming the door behind her. She raced to the front of the store, her heart pounding in her chest. The lights flickered back on just as she reached the counter, but the sense of safety they provided was fleeting. She knew she had to leave, but the thought of going outside, where the figure had been standing, filled her with dread. She grabbed the phone to call the police, but the line was dead. No dial tone, no connection, nothing. Panic set in as she realized she was completely cut off. The store felt like a trap, and she was the prey. Without another thought, Karen grabbed her keys and bolted for the door. She unlocked it and sprinted to her car, not daring to look back. As she fumbled with the keys, she heard it. A faint whisper, almost like a breeze calling her name. Karen. She froze, every muscle in her body tensing. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it filled her with a deep, primal fear. She forced herself to unlock the car door and jump inside, locking it behind her. As she started the engine, she risked a glance in the rearview mirror. Her blood ran cold. The figure was standing right behind her car, its face still hidden in shadow, but this time she could see its eyes, glowing, piercing eyes that stared straight into hers. She hit the gas, tires screeching as she tore out of the parking lot, the figure disappearing into the night as she sped away. Karen didn't stop driving until she reached the safety of her apartment, her heart still racing from the terror she had just experienced. She locked herself inside and collapsed onto the couch, trembling uncontrollably. The events of the night played over and over in her mind, but one question lingered above all others. What had she seen, and why had it targeted her? She called the police, reporting the strange figure and the attempted break-in at the store. When they arrived to investigate, they found the store completely undisturbed. No signs of forced entry, no strange symbols, nothing out of the ordinary. The window in the storage room was locked and there were no handprints, no footprints, nothing to indicate that anyone had been there. Karen knew what she had seen, what she had experienced, but there was no evidence to support her story. The police left, advising her to take some time off work and rest, but she knew she wouldn't find peace anytime soon. That night, as she lay in bed, every shadow seemed to take on a life of its own, every sound a reminder of the terror that had stalked her. Weeks passed, but the fear never left her. She quit her job at the convenience store and moved to a new city, hoping to leave the memories behind. But every now and then, when she's alone at night, she swears she hears it again, that faint whisper calling her name, reminding her that some things can never be escaped. Emily and her husband, Mark, had recently moved into a quaint old house on the outskirts of town. The house was a fixer-upper, but it was spacious and full of character. Emily, a freelance musician, fell in love with the place the moment she saw it. The wide windows let in plenty of light, and the large attic seemed perfect for her to set up a music studio. From the very first night, Emily noticed something strange. As she lay in bed, she could faintly hear music, soft, distant, almost like a lullaby. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, or maybe a neighbor playing music late at night. But the melody was odd. Unlike anything she had ever heard, it was hauntingly beautiful, yet there was something unsettling about it. The next morning, she mentioned it to Mark, who brushed it off as the house settling, or possibly wind playing tricks. But as the days went on, the melody persisted, always at night, always faint, but unmistakably there. Emily tried to ignore it, but it began to invade her thoughts, affecting her work. She found herself humming the tune unconsciously, unable to shake it from her mind. One evening, determined to find the source, Emily decided to follow the sound. She walked through the house, the melody guiding her, leading her up the creaky stairs to the attic. The closer she got, the louder the music became. When she finally reached the attic door, the music stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Emily hesitated before opening the attic door, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath and turned the knob, the old wood creaking as she pushed the door open. The attic was dimly lit, the only light coming from the small round window on the far wall. Dust motes danced in the air as Emily stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under her weight. She looked around the room, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, just some old furniture boxes and an antique wardrobe in the corner. The silence was deafening after the haunting melody she had heard moments before. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she approached the wardrobe. Something about it seemed off, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Slowly, she opened the wardrobe doors, half expecting to find something sinister inside, but it was empty, save for a few moth-eaten coats hanging from the rail. disappointed and relieved at the same time. She closed the wardrobe and turned to leave the attic. As she reached the door, the melody started again, louder this time, echoing through the attic. Emily froze, her blood running cold. The music was coming from the wardrobe. She turned back, her hands trembling as she reached for the door again. This time, she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a small hidden compartment at the back of the wardrobe. With trembling hands, she opened the compartment. Inside was an old, dusty music box. It looked ancient, with intricate carvings on the surface. Emily's curiosity got the better of her, and she wound up the key. The melody that played was the same one she had been hearing, but now it was clear and strong, filling the attic with its haunting tune. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the music box. She spent hours researching it, trying to find any information she could about its origins. Eventually, she discovered that the house had a tragic history. Decades ago, it had belonged to a young couple, much like herself and Mark. The wife, a talented musician, had composed a beautiful lullaby for her unborn child. But tragedy struck when she lost the baby in childbirth, and in her grief, she took her own life in the attic. According to the legend, the woman's spirit never left house. It was said that she continued to play the lullaby she composed, a melody filled with sorrow and longing. The music box had been hers, a gift from her husband who couldn't bear to stay in the house after her death. The house remained vacant for years, and the story of the haunting melody became nothing more than a local legend. Emily was deeply disturbed by the story. She couldn't stop thinking about the woman's tragic fate and the eerie connection she felt to the music. That night, as she lay in bed, the melody started again, but this time it was different. It was louder, more insistent, as if it were calling out to her, begging her to listen. She got up and went to the attic, drawn by the music. As she entered the room, the melody swelled, filling the space with its haunting beauty. Emily felt a presence in the room, a coldness that seeped into her bones. She looked around, but there was no one there, only the music box, playing its mournful tune. Emily couldn't escape the music. It haunted her day and night, consuming her thoughts and invading her dreams. She started to withdraw from Mark, unable to explain the hold the music had on her. She knew it wasn't just a melody. It was a message, a plea from the spirit of the woman who had lived and died in the house. One night, the music grew so loud that it woke Mark. He found Emily standing in the attic, staring at the music box, her eyes glazed over as if in a trance. He tried to snap her out of it, but she seemed lost in the melody, unable to break free. Desperate to help his wife, Mark did the only thing he could think of. He destroyed the music box. He grabbed it from her hands and smashed it against the floor, the haunting melody cutting off abruptly as the box shattered into pieces. Emily collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face, as if she had lost something precious. But the destruction of the music box did not bring peace. Instead, it unleashed something far more terrifying. The temperature in the attic dropped sharply, and a gust of wind slammed the door shut. The lights flickered, and the room was filled with an eerie, ghostly presence. The spirit of the woman, now freed from the confines of the music box, was angry. Mark and Emily were trapped, the room closing in around them as the spirit's anger manifested in the physical world. The walls shook, and the floorboards creaked ominously. The ghostly figure of the woman appeared before them, her eyes filled with sorrow and rage. Just when it seemed like the spirit's anger would consume them, Emily did the only thing she could think of. She began to sing the lullaby. Her voice was shaky at first, but as she continued, it grew stronger. The spirit paused, her anger dissipating as she listened to the familiar melody. The room fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as Emily sang the lullaby that had once brought comfort to the woman. The ghostly figure began to fade, her expression softening as she was finally able to let go of her grief. Emily continued to sing until the spirit disappeared completely, leaving the room cold but peaceful. The ordeal had taken its toll on both Emily and Mark, but they knew the spirit was finally at rest. The next morning, the house felt different, warmer, more welcoming. The haunting melody was gone, leaving only the memory of the tragic events that had unfolded. Emily and Mark decided to move out, leaving the house and its ghosts behind, but the experience would stay with them forever. a reminder of the power of music and the lingering pain of a broken heart. James had just moved into a new apartment, a small but cozy place on the third floor of an old building. It was a fresh start for him after a rough breakup, and he was eager to put the past behind him. The apartment was perfect, quiet, affordable, and close to work. But there was something about it that felt off from the moment he moved in. The first night was uneventful, but James had trouble sleeping. He kept waking up, feeling like someone was watching him. He brushed it off as nerves and exhaustion from the move. But as the days went on, the feeling persisted. He started to notice little things. His belongings would be slightly out of place. Doors that he was sure he had closed would be open, and there was always that unsettling feeling of being watched. One evening, as James was unpacking the last of his boxes, he found an old, faded photograph hidden in the back of a drawer. It was a picture of a man, but his face was completely blurred as if the camera had malfunctioned. The rest of the photo was clear, an old apartment building that looked eerily similar to the one James was living in. A chill ran down his spine as he stared at the photo, unable to shake the feeling that the man in the picture was somehow connected to his unease. That night, the nightmares began. James dreamed of the man in the photograph, standing at the foot of his bed, his faceless head tilted as if he were watching him. The dreams were so vivid that James would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. But every time he opened his eyes, he was alone. As the weeks went on, the nightmares grew worse. James was plagued by visions of the faceless man, not just in his dreams but in waking moments too. He would catch glimpses of the figure in mirrors, reflections, and even in the corner of his eye, only for it to disappear when he turned to look. The more he saw the faceless man, the more his sense of reality began to blur. He started to question his sanity, wondering if the stress of the move and the breakup had finally caught up with him. One night, as James was watching TV in the living room, the power suddenly went out. The apartment was plunged into darkness, and in the silence, James heard a faint shuffling sound coming from the hallway. His heart raced as he fumbled for his phone, using the flashlight to guide him. The shuffling grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the living room door. James held his breath, the beam of light shaking in his hand as he pointed it towards the door. Slowly, the door creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was the faceless man. James froze, his mind screaming at him to move, to run, but his body wouldn't obey. The faceless man stood there, unmoving, his head tilted as if he were studying James. Finally, the man stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. James could see him more clearly now. The blurred face, the indistinct features, the way the shadows clung to him like a second skin. The faceless man reached out, his hand hovering just inches from James's face, and then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The lights flickered back on, and the apartment was empty once again. But the fear remained, gripping James's heart with icy fingers. He knew now that the faceless man was not just a figment of his imagination. He was real, and he was getting closer. James became obsessed with the faceless man. He scoured the internet for any information he could find about the apartment building, the photograph, or similar hauntings, but there was nothing. It was as if the faceless man didn't exist outside of James's mind. His paranoia grew, driving him to the brink of madness. He started to keep the lights on at all times, afraid of what he might see in the dark. But no matter how hard he tried to avoid it, the faceless man always found a way into his life. He appeared in reflections, in the shadows, and even in the background of photos James took. It was as if the man was trying to send a message, but James couldn't decipher it. All he knew was that the man was always there, lurking just out of sight. The nightmares became more frequent, more intense. James would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat. The image of the faceless man burned into his mind. He started to lose track of time, his days and nights blending together in a haze of fear and exhaustion. The faceless man was consuming him, slowly driving him insane. Desperate for help, James reached out to a local paranormal investigator. The investigator, a woman named Sarah, agreed to come to the apartment and see if she could find any traces of the supernatural. James was skeptical, but willing to try anything to get rid of the faceless man. Sarah arrived the next day, armed with various tools and a calm, professional demeanor. She listened to James's story without judgment, taking notes and asking questions. After a thorough inspection of the apartment, she set up her equipment and began the investigation. As night fell, the apartment grew eerily quiet. Sarah and James sat in the living room, waiting for any sign of the faceless man. Hours passed, and just when they were starting to lose hope, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The lights flickered and the shuffling sound returned, growing louder with each passing second. Sarah instructed James to stay calm as she focused on her equipment. The shuffling grew closer, and then, there he was, the faceless man standing in the hallway, just as James had seen him before. Sarah gasped, her usually calm exterior cracking as she saw the apparition for the first time. The faceless man began to move towards them, his form becoming more solid with each step. Sarah tried to communicate with the spirit, asking it questions, but there was no response. The faceless man continued to advance, his head tilting as if he were observing them. Suddenly, the equipment started to malfunction. The lights flickered wildly, and the faceless man surged forward, reaching out towards James. In a moment of pure terror, James grabbed the photograph from the table and held it up. The faceless man paused, his blurred features seemingly fixated on the image. Sarah quickly realized that the photograph held some significance to the spirit. She urged James to confront the faceless man, to demand answers. With trembling hands, James asked the spirit what it wanted, why it was haunting him. The faceless man remained silent, but his form began to shimmer as if he were trying to reveal something. In a flash, memories flooded James's mind, memories that weren't his. He saw the building as it had been decades ago, a bustling apartment complex. He saw a man, faceless, moving through the halls, a man who had died under mysterious circumstances. The man had been forgotten, his death unmarked, and his spirit had been trapped, wandering the building in search of someone to remember him. James realized that the faceless man wasn't trying to harm him. He was trying to communicate, to be acknowledged. The photograph had been the only trace of his existence, a fleeting memory that had survived through time. By confronting the spirit, James had given him the recognition he had been seeking for so long. The faceless man slowly began to fade, his form becoming less distinct until he disappeared entirely. The apartment returned to normal, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as the spirit finally found peace. Sarah and James sat in silence, the weight of the experience settling over them. The nightmares stopped after that, and James no longer felt the presence of the faceless man. The photograph remained on his table, a reminder of the spirit who had once haunted him. He knew now that the man had simply wanted to be remembered, and in doing so, had finally been able to move on. James continued to live in the apartment, but it was no longer a place of fear. It had become a place of reflection, a place where the past had finally been put to rest. And in the quiet of the night, James would sometimes think of the faceless man, grateful that he had been able to help him find peace. Arif had just moved into a small, quaint apartment in a quiet neighborhood. After years of living in the noisy, crowded city, he was looking forward to some peace and solitude. The apartment was old but well-maintained, with antique furniture that added a certain charm to the place. There was one thing, however, that caught Arif's attention: a large, ornate mirror in the living room, its frame intricately carved with strange symbols. From the moment he stepped into the apartment, Arif felt an odd presence, like someone was watching him. He brushed it off as nerves from the move, but the feeling persisted. At night, the apartment was eerily silent, with only the occasional creak of the wooden floors breaking the stillness. But Arif was determined to enjoy his new home and pushed the unsettling thoughts aside. One night, as Arif was reading a book in the living room, he noticed something strange in the mirror. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a shadow move across the glass. Startled, he looked up, but there was nothing there, just his own reflection staring back at him. He shook his head and went back to his book, convincing himself it was just his imagination. But the next night it happened again. This time, the shadow lingered, hovering just behind him in the reflection. Arif's heart raced as he turned around, but once again, there was nothing there. The mirror, however, seemed different, darker, almost like it was hiding something. As the days passed, The shadow in the mirror became more pronounced. Arif would catch glimpses of it, always lurking just out of sight. It started to take shape. A figure, tall and thin, with indistinct features that seemed to shift and blur whenever he tried to focus on them. Arif couldn't shake the feeling that the figure in the mirror was trying to communicate with him. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something more, something with intent. He started researching the history of the apartment and the mirror, hoping to find some explanation. He discovered that the mirror had been part of the apartment for decades, passed down from tenant to tenant. Rumor had it that the original owner, a reclusive artist named Yasir, had become obsessed with the mirror, claiming it was a portal to another world. Yasir had disappeared mysteriously, leaving behind only his paintings, which depicted strange, distorted faces that seemed to reach out from the canvas. Arif realized that the figure in the mirror might be Yasir himself, trapped between worlds, unable to move on. The more he thought about it, the more he became convinced that Yasir's spirit was trying to reach out to him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Arif decided to confront the figure in the mirror. He stood in front of it, staring into the glass, waiting for the shadow to appear. The room grew colder, and the light seemed to drain from the walls, leaving everything in a dull, lifeless hue. The figure emerged clearer than ever before. It stood directly behind Arif, its face a twisted, tormented mask. Arif could feel its presence, cold and oppressive, as if the very air around him had turned to ice. But he didn't back away. Instead, he spoke to the figure, asking it what it wanted. The mirror began to tremble, the surface rippling as if it were made of water. The figure's face twisted in agony, and Arif heard a voice, faint, echoing, as if it were coming from a great distance. It was Yasir, pleading for help, begging to be released from the prison he had unknowingly created for himself. Arif knew he had to do something to help Yasir's spirit find peace. He remembered reading about a ritual that could free trapped souls, and though he was skeptical, he was willing to try anything. He gathered the necessary items, candles, incense, and a piece of Yasir's artwork that he had found in the attic, and set them up around the mirror. As he began the ritual, the room grew colder, and the figure in the mirror became more agitated. Arif recited the incantation, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. The mirror started to crack, the surface splintering as the ritual reached its climax. The figure in the mirror let out a mournful wail, the sound echoing through the apartment. Arif pressed on, pouring all his will into the ritual. The mirror shattered, the pieces scattering across the floor, and with it, the figure dissolved into nothingness. The room warmed instantly, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as if a weight had been removed. Arif stood there, breathing heavily as the silence settled around him. He knew that Yasir's spirit had finally been released, free to move on to whatever lay beyond. In the days that followed, the apartment felt different, lighter, more welcoming. Arif no longer felt the eerie presence that had haunted him from the moment he arrived. The shattered mirror was replaced with a simple painting, a reminder of the spirit he had helped free. Arif continued to live in the apartment, grateful for the peace he had found and the connection he had made with a lost soul. And though he would sometimes think of Yasir, he knew that the artist was finally at rest. His tormented spirit no longer trapped in the shadows of the past.